All right. Where's my mouse? Where is my mouse? All right, hey-o, this is a slide. Cool, we will see lots of them. So the title of my talk today is Things to Keep in Mind When Working in the World of Responsive Design. Before we go any further, to anyone who worked on the website and the booklet for this event, I apologize for the long-ass title. It must have been a pain to have it all fit. I promise I did not intentionally try to make it that long.
It was, but we love you anyway.
Thank you. Alrighty, so this is me, this is my face. My name's Haris. I am very excited to be here. The hype is a little too real. When the hype gets too real, it gets too fast. If you need me to slow down a little bit, please let me know. I'd be happy to do so. I also may swear a wee bit. I can't stop, so I'm just apologizing ahead of time if it offends any of you. Let's move on. I'm a front-end developer at Shopify. I help build the embedded apps platform there. We work on something called the buy button and the JavaScript SDK that allows you to integrate Shopify into your own websites. I'm an instructor at HackerU, similar to Anne, who we met earlier. Where's Anne? She's not here yet. Hi, Anne. I'm also the content lead at Ladies Learning Code, helping push the boundaries of development further and make it more accessible to the world at large. I'm also a freelancer, and I also have a slew of side projects, one of them being something called Focus Pocus, which assists in form submissions when you're working with static HTML websites. If you don't have a server, you don't want to write PHP or any other server-side language to handle your form submissions, you can use my service. It'll do it for you, and it is free. I also have a platform called DevToast, which is a place where I upload little video clips or little screencasts to help junior developers level up and become more intermediate and show you tips and techniques in the world of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Since I obviously have so much more time on my hands, I also have an online store where I sell developer and tech-related pins, like this one I'm wearing right now. So if you're interested in picking up one of these, let me know. I have a whole bunch with me today. We can chat about that later. So I've also, because of this new business endeavor, been referred to as the kingpin at my workplace, which is pretty entertaining, and I get to take dope-ass pictures like that. Anywho, I'm also quite obsessed with Emma Watson. She will probably appear multiple times in this presentation. Dope. So our story starts back in 300 BC when table layouts were created. This is a dope-ass website made using tables, and at first you can't really tell where the table cells and all that stuff's happening. So I popped into DevTools, gave everything a border, all the table cells and all that shit, and we get this. Damn, that looks amazing. This is still live. It still exists. Go check it out. It's hella cool. So, from 300 BC, time went by, and mobile devices were created, mobile browsers came along, and then we got to a point where we had websites.com and m.website.com, and that was shit. I was working at IBM at this point, working at in their e-commerce department, building e-commerce software, and it was disgusting, having to maintain two massive code bases to achieve for the exact same website. Not very fun. 2010 rolls around, and this dude named Ethan writes a blog post or an article called Responsive Web Design. Mic drop. And he talks about three main features that are going to revolutionize the web. First being fluid grids, or fluid layouts, focusing on layouts. Flexible images, something that Anne spoke about earlier today as well. And media queries. We all know and love media queries today. These would be the technical ingredients of responsive web design. That was his thought, that was the future, and he wanted everyone to embrace it. And most importantly, he wanted all of us to start thinking in a different way. That was going to be the most important aspect, to say, hey, we don't need two code bases, we don't need three code bases, we're going to have one, and we have to change the way we think, change the way we work to make this a real thing and have this work for everything. So, 6 years later, it's 2016, and the landscape has continuously been changing for the world of responsive design. It is whack. There are tons of features that CSS has, JavaScript have. There's a whole bunch of tools. We'll be exploring a whole bunch of those, and I'll be sharing a bunch of tips and pointers that I like to use and suggest and recommend when working with the responsive web design. And these will range anywhere between very, very technical, heavy concepts to more UX-related concepts as well. So it will be a whole bunch of everything, and hopefully at least some of it sticks, and some of it will be helpful for you today. So first, let's talk about CSS layouts. Berman spoke about this a little bit, where we started off with floats. Floats and inline block help us focus on individual elements. That's the state of mind you need to be in when you're working with those. I need to float this element. I need to display inline block this element and work on the sizing for those specific elements. Cool. In came flexbox. And everyone went crazy. It's like, hot damn, this is so cool. Everyone's loving it. This is dope. It's kind of confusing. And it completely changed the way you're supposed to think about the web. You're no longer focusing on individual elements. You're thinking about the flow. You're looking at the container and the children inside that container. Now, if you remember Berman's talk right before lunch, you'll notice that the majority of CSS properties that we were looking at were applied to the container and not the elements inside the container. And that's because the thought or the space of mind you're supposed to be in when working with Flexbox is the flow of elements or the flow of children. So you're not worried about how this one item is going to behave. You're worrying about or paying attention to how all these items inside this container are going to flow. And that, whoever said that, A+. And that pertains to direction first and foremost, and then also alignment and a whole bunch of other stuff that we saw in our talk earlier. So we're now thinking in a cohesive whole. We are no longer thinking about, oh, this one particular element needs to be this particular size, or that particular element needs to be floated. We are now looking at a container, looking at all the elements inside and saying, how do these need to flow and react with each other as a cohesive whole, different parts that work together to create this container. This is an extremely different way of thinking when working with floats, when working with inline block. And I think that this is the challenging part when it comes to working with Flexbox and not necessarily the properties. The properties, as we looked at earlier, are fairly straightforward. They're just a whole bunch of other CSS properties. But it's how do we use those and how do we leverage those properties, use them together to create this cohesive whole and create these awesome flows in our work. The next thing that Flexbox helped us with was sizing. We were no longer asking, what width does this X thing need to be? We weren't applying specific widths anymore. Oh, hey, all right. I'm just going to pause right there for a sec. All right, we're good. No, we're not. I'm just going to keep going. We now instead have to think about what width or ratio does this need to be relative to its siblings. And I'm going to give you an example of that by using a very, very common design layout that we'll see on the web. We've got a main section and we've got a sidebar. Quite often, if you're using floats or inline block, you'll have something like this. You'll have them sit side by side however you do. You'll have a width of 66%. The other one will be 33%. You have that stupid 1% left over. You'll probably do like 66.66666 and 33.33333 to have it round up to 100. Otherwise, you get an awkward little gap. Anywho, this is how you would normally approach it. With Flexbox, you're no longer thinking in specific sizes, but in ratios. So if we take that same example, we're now going to use the flex grow property and say that that main section has twice the size of the sidebar. Crazy. That's crazy. That's super cool. And it doesn't matter how big the container is or how small the container is. We're saying that these are the ratios that these things need to maintain regardless of the container's size. So this is the main concept that Flexbox tries to implement. The change in flow and how these things react in terms of ratios and not specific sizes. Dope. All right, so let's have a look at a common layout example that exists as well. Something similar to what we just looked at, where we have those two things. We have a main section and a sidebar, but we want the layout to be a little bit different when we go to a smaller breakpoint. We want that sidebar to sit at the top. This happens sometimes. Some people like to have their little bio section on the right-hand side. Their navigation will be on their right. And when we hit this mobile breakpoint, we want that sidebar to move up to the top. Now, if you look at the DOM, the DOM is going to have, or HTML is going to have that main section appear first in the HTML, and then we'll have that sidebar. So how do we achieve this layout? The first option is by using absolute positioning. What you'll end up doing is you'll absolute position that sidebar, stick it to the top, and then apply a margin top or a padding top to that main section to compensate for that absolutely positioned item. Right? Have we done this before? Yeah? Yuck. That's fucking disgusting. It's so annoying, because this is honestly how I feel like. I feel like I'm working on something specific, it's about to collapse, and some other crazy shit happens instead. It is not fun. It's extremely frustrating to have to work with absolute positioning and whatnot because you have no idea how other things might react to it because you're breaking out of the usual flow of the internets. All right, so how would you do this in Flexbox? We just looked at Flexbox. How does Flexbox make this better? So if we have a look at this, what we want to do instead is by default, we have flex direction row. That is the default value applied. And what we want to do is when we hit that smaller breakpoint, all we need to do is change the direction to row reverse. And now both of those two items are now appearing in the opposite way or in the opposite direction at that breakpoint. So now, just by one line of CSS, no weird absolute positioning, we have the sidebar appearing first in our actual rendering of our HTML web page. Cool. And because flex direction row is the default, we don't even have to apply it. So all we need is one line of CSS at that breakpoint to achieve that particular layout without any weird hacky shit. Cool? Cool? All right. So let's say you're working on a project that needs IE9 support and lower, or you need some, like you're not happy with your comfort level with Flexbox yet, it's still kind of too new to you, and you want to achieve something like this, but you can't use Flexbox, or you don't want to use Flexbox. You have certain limitations, and Flexbox is just not an option for you. What do? Well, display inline block also lets you do this. If we go back to that same example, and you decide to use display inline block to have those two things sit side by side, and you set their widths to be 100% at a specific breakpoint, they would stack like this. Right, cool. But there's a CSS property called direction, which works with things that are inline blocked or inline. And what that allows you to do is say that the direction is from right to left instead of left to right. And this is very similar to direction or flex direction row reverse that we would see in Flexbox. So you can use display inline block, which supports all the way back to IE8, which is a lot more easier to consume than Flexbox, and still achieve awesome looking layouts without needing any crazy ass positioning. So, my tip to you is learn to control the content flow. The flow is the most important aspect. If you're able to understand the flow of the items that you're working with, you'll be able to better understand what you need to do without having some crazy janky effects on the other things surrounding it. All right, next, sizing and measurements. PX, yeah, pixels, dope. Everything was a fixed pixel-based layout. Everything had fixed pixel-based layouts, especially in the world of tables. And as time went by, we slightly moved towards percentage-based layouts. Yeah. We started doing stuff like this. Width 100% for our main wrapper, and we would give it a max width and say don't extend past a certain point in case you're fancy and you have those 27-inch iMacs sitting at home. It's just like too much space, too much space. So you want your website nice and contained to the middle of your screen. Nice. We want to take that concept and push that even further, because pixels are just not enough to make things responsive. There's a whole bunch of other ways to denote sizing. Percentages, Ms, Rems, VH, VW. I highly recommend you explore some of these and learn what they are and how they work. They've been around for a while, especially the first three. I really, really recommend and urge you to explore these a whole bunch further. These aren't just like random things that no one's using. Foundation 5, made by those Zerb peeps, Foundation 5 is live, it exists, it's already out. It has moved towards using Ms and Rems to do its sizing instead of using pixel-based values for typography, for example. Bootstrap 4, which is currently in beta and it will be coming out soon, is also heading in this direction. And they're also, as a side note, releasing a feature flag that you can turn on and off if you want to use Flexbox to do your layouts instead of using floats, which they currently use. Pretty cool, pretty cool. So if these massive-ass companies are finally able to get their shit together and release these, not that they're bad, like I'm sorry, I'm not trying to insult you guys. Don't hate me, I'm sorry. If they're able to like put in that effort and make this now a real thing, that just goes to show the importance of using these forms of measurement and flexbox in the world today. That they're becoming standards, they're becoming so useful and so important, they save so much time. So I highly recommend you check them out. So for example, this is what a pixel-based styling stuffs would look like. You've got some font sizes applied to an H1 and a paragraph, and then you have a media query, and then you resize them down. This looks all right because we only have 2 CSS things, but let's say you had like 40 or 50 different maybe not 40 or 50, but maybe you had 15 different typographic elements that needed different sizing. This would get a little bit out of control, becomes tedious, becomes annoying. So what do you do instead? If we were to use rems, you apply a base font size on the HTML element. So we say 14 pixels. And then everything else, when it comes to font size, is defined in a rem. And what that means is going to take the font size applied on the HTML element and multiply it by that number you've given. So our H1 is going to be 14 times 3. That's the value that H1 is going to have. Our paragraphs with the class of large are going to be 1.2 times the size times 14. That's going to be their value that gets calculated and implemented by default. Now, the cool thing is when it comes to the responsive aspect, we only need to make one change. We just need to change the root font size from 14 to 10, or to 8, or to 12. Or if you're working on massive screens, maybe bump it up to 22. And all the other things will automatically update their multiplying and use the new value instead of using 14 at that breakpoint. And you'll see all of your content scale, grow, and shrink based on that particular value. Once again, it's kind of like flow. All these elements are working with each other instead of like componentized and living and breathing by themselves. This becomes extremely helpful. So I would recommend exploring all of those things, all of those different types of measurements, and see if you can start implementing some of those in your projects. Because quite frankly, I think very, very soon, pixels are dead. Or the pixel measurement is going to die. Unless there's like very, very specific use cases. Next, we've got media queries. When they first were, Nathan first wrote his article, this was sort of a suggestion where you would have 3 different link items, each linking out to a different CSS file, and the media property would be set to screen and the specific device size or max width, min width, whatever. This changed over time. We no longer have multiple files for each different breakpoint. We now just have little chunks of code inside our CSS that we can define and write CSS inside those chunks to say this is the overrides we're going to need, or this is the CSS that we want applied at this particular breakpoint. We've all seen this. We're all familiar with this? Yeah, dope, cool. But if you notice yourself doing this, where you've got 3 breakpoints and they're all kind of close, you know you kind of feel shitty doing it, but you know you kind of have to. I'm going to call you out. You're probably doing something wrong. There's probably a way to avoid this. And if you take the time, take the 10 minutes you might need to figure out what that is, it will save you a giant amount of headache, I guarantee you. A couple things to do: try and avoid fixed measurements. If you're getting very, very specific measurements, try and avoid them. Try and use percentage-based measurements instead and see how that works out. Try avoiding absolute positioning like that example that we saw. You might need it. That might totally be fine. It might be the actual way that you need to implement something. But look at it again. Do I really need to do it that way? Maybe there's another way I can do this instead. And lastly, magic numbers. What the hell is a magic number? This. What the hell does 43 pixels mean? Every now and then I'll see someone's CSS and they've got this random number with no comment associated with it, and it just works that way. If you make it 1 pixel smaller, it explodes. If you make it a pixel bigger, it looks stupid. What? What is so weird about 43? That is shitty magic. Don't use numbers like that. That is the most garbage kind of magic. Please avoid that. It's really, really easy to do. Try using percentages instead. I guarantee you it will make your life easier. This is good magic. Yeah. This is the best kind of magic. All right, so I work at Shopify. Shopify is a big company. We've got a massive group of developers, especially for front-end developers, and we have what we call scale. We're a very big company. We've got lots of stuff going on. How do we handle responsive web design at scale? These are just a few tips that I'm going to be giving from my perspective that I've done at Shopify and that I've done at my previous agency and I've done through my freelance work. So, but because the problem is, we kind of just assume we're just like by ourselves, just hacking away. Yeah, look at us. We're like writing some dope-ass code, and no one's going to stop us. But the problem is, it becomes extremely hard to maintain and organize that CSS that you wrote by yourself. We think we're being badass. We think this is really cool. You pass it off to someone else. They have no idea what the hell you're doing. It becomes extremely, extremely difficult to maintain the larger your project gets. So it's extremely important when it comes to large projects or large teams to manage your code better. And the best way to do this is to do it all of the time. If you're working on a small project, use some of these principles and concepts in those projects. When they become best practices and habits, you'll start applying them everywhere. I build tiny little websites. I built my own little website. It's like 3 pages long. There's nothing crazy about it. But I use these principles in that as well to always be in that habit so I never start writing shitty code. So I have 2 main recommendations when you're working with our responsive web design at scale. And they both only work if you're using pre-processed CSS. So that means you're using Sass or Less or Stylus or Post CSS or something along those lines to create some CSS and generate it, write something else and generate it into CSS. The first thing that you should leverage is a breakpoint mixin. Now there's various ways to write it. You can tailor one to your needs, to your preferences, to your coding style, but in general, it'll look something like this, where you create a breakpoint that allows you to pass in a variable for point, and we'll see an example of how that would work. And if that variable that you've passed in is desktop, it'll take all of the content that you applied, generate a media query at the desktop size, and drop your content inside that. Or tablet, or mobile, and you can add a whole bunch of additional variables for your various breakpoints. So for example, if I had an element of class something, I can include that breakpoint at the mobile level, at the mobile variable, add in padding 10 pixels, and that will generate a media query that I need at that particular measurement that I have here in this mixin, and add that padding 10 pixels as the content. So why is this helpful? One, it defines a set of breakpoints. You immediately are avoiding having those 3 or 4 breakpoints that are kind of the same, but you're too lazy to figure out why they're like not working the way you want them to. You have to ensure consistency. You're using the exact same number of breakpoints, and that makes your code base cleaner and easier to maintain. And then when you do need to add something else, it creates a conversation. You're discussing and talking with the rest of your team to decide whether or not that's a valuable breakpoint to add. Why do we need to add that in? Do we need to re-explore our design just to accommodate this one tiny thing? Maybe we can talk to the designers, or if we design it ourselves, change that just slightly to have it accommodate our breakpoints. You can have that conversation. As front-end web developers, it is our job to be friends with and work closely with designers. At Shopify, front-end developers and designers both sit under the user experience umbrella. We're considered part of the same group of people because we work very, very closely with them. Next, I would recommend writing modular CSS. There's lots and lots of ways to do this. The main idea at the core and at the root is to separate your CSS into objects and concerns. So for example, you would have a main.scss file if you're writing in Sass, and you would import individual files that handle specific concerns or specific objects. So for example, our base file would just have some margin styling and some box sizing, and that's it. Nothing else goes there. Leave it nice and simple and nice and clean. And our tile.scss would have some basic styling for the tile element and include all of the breakpoint and responsive code in that same file. Now, this does a couple of things. One, it keeps all your code related to that one module in that same file. That makes your life way easier to organize. Anything that you could possibly need to do with tiles, for example, is going to be in that file. You know exactly what it's called. It's based on the name of that object you're working with, so it's extremely easy to find and work on. Next, if you have a big team and you're using something like GitHub and version control, you can be working on the same project in various files. I can work on the buttons object. So-and-so can work on the tile object. And we can work on our individual components, and they'll eventually come together and start working together to build out these specific layouts that we need. You can also use helpers and utility classes. So we could import another file that has things like h.textCenter that just centers some text, and also h.textCenter-mobile, where you have a breakpoint and applies text-align center just at that breakpoint. So you can start using these classes to apply small changes to your layout instead of having to repeat text-align center, text-align center, text-align center over and over again. Now, this is a fine balance. You have to make sure you're not overdoing yourself and you have 3,000 helper classes. This is something that's meant that you see happen a lot. Something that exists over and over again, something that's a very common pattern, you can turn into helper or utility classes and use those. Object-oriented CSS and BEM are two of these concepts that work very well with modular CSS. This is what we use at work. I would recommend checking it out. It is super, super good stuff. If you want some videos or some articles, check out this English dude named Harry Roberts. He's crazy. He's super cool. He talks about this stuff all the time in CSS architecture. That is his shit. All right. Yes, and that is what we do at Shopify as well. It leads to reusable and maintainable responsive code, which is really sexy code. And you're saying, can code be sexy? Oh, you bet. All right, so there's this concept of desktop versus mobile. That has changed because originally we just had iPads and phones and maybe a couple other devices, and that's no longer sufficient because we have a crazy number of devices and different ways to interact with them. We have hundreds of devices, various pixel densities, even iPhone versus iPhone, like the ones that exist today, they have different pixel densities and sizes, so it's crazy. We also have crazy large HD TVs with your Xbox plugged in that uses Internet Explorer or Edge, depending on what version you're on, and you're controlling with Kinect. Holy shit, that's not my website, that's not my browser anymore. You need to start accommodating for that potentially as well, if that's something you're designing for. Then we have the Apple Watch that we need to start thinking about as well, and others really, really tiny devices as well. Never leave a feature unusable on a particular platform if you're supporting it. So one common thing I see is hover states. Quite often I'll see different tiles, like this is the kind of work we do, and you have to hover over it to see some text, to see some context. That is ridiculous for mobile devices because you can't hover. No one will know that they have to click that to see that text. So you immediately have lost, your users have immediately lost so much context about your website because they can't hover on your website because of the device they're on. So have those hover effects on mobile and things that have hoverable effects available, but on devices that you can't hover, make sure you add some CSS to show that content without having to hover or click or anything like that. All right, so let's talk about some more media queries, device detection, and feature detection. So first and foremost, this is a very common situation where you'll have a mobile device and you'll throw the hamburger icon in the top left corner. This is my menu. Done. Now the problem is you have different sized screens on different sized phones. You can't accommodate that same concept or that same paradigm on every single mobile device. Oh, it's a mobile phone. Just throw in the top left corner. It doesn't work like that. Have you seen the iPhone 6 Plus? It is bigger than my face. It is insane. I look stupid holding it, so I try not to. So what you can do is take that and move it to the bottom right corner instead. If it's absolutely positioned or fixed positioned, move it to the bottom right corner. Bring it closer to my hand so I can click it instead of having to kind of like shuffle my hand down and like do like a big crazy reach. Just move it to the bottom right-hand corner instead. You'll see more and more companies, more and more websites start following this pattern. The biggest company doing stuff like this is Google's Material Design. If you look at any of their comps, if you look at any of their apps, their main menu icon is in the bottom right-hand corner instead of being in the top left now. Facebook is also heading towards this direction, where their main menu is now sitting at the bottom. Yes, I know, I haven't checked my notifications, whatever. And their main hamburger menu sits in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll start noticing these little trends pick up more and more because people are realizing that these larger and larger phones are becoming harder and harder to use because not everyone has giant hands. So we need to accommodate for the common people. Come on. Also, navigation structures. Quite often we will see this Cool, we've got 4 items, A+, and they'll throw it into a hamburger menu, done. I asked you to pause. Do you even need a hamburger menu? Seriously, the number of times I see people have like 2 menu items and just chuck it into a hamburger menu just because that's like the cool thing to do, it's ridiculous. If you're hiding menu items, you're reducing visibility and decreasing and impacting the user experience that the user is going to have. If you can have those things fit without needing to throw them into a hamburger menu, please do that. Talk with your designer. See if that's a necessity for your particular design case. All right, so if we go back to this, let's say you do need it. You're like, yeah, I need a hamburger menu. Cool, you click it, you see this. Now, the problem is, at the main thing that we need, the home or the primary thing that people are going to need to navigate to is that first item. So that's really hard to reach once again. So what you'll see happen quite often is you can take that first item and move it to the bottom on mobile devices. You can use display inline block and like use that direction stuff, or you can use the flexbox order property and change the order of the sequence and bring that item further down. To make this even better, you can take that same concept of taking that hamburger icon and moving it to the bottom right to create a far more accessible navigation on your mobile devices. And you can decide that, you know what, maybe I don't really like this across all mobile devices, then target just the really big ones. Have this feature available for iPhone 6 Pluses and other large phablets or whatever the hell they call them. I guarantee your users will really, really appreciate it. Don't just make things fit. That's quite obvious, like, oh yeah, just make them fit. That's it, responsive web design. No, everything needs to have a purpose and a reason. So responsive web design is more important than ever. Mobile devices, the usage of mobile devices is increasing, desktop devices is decreasing, more and more people don't even have desktop devices, they just use their mobile phones and tablets, those are the only devices that they use, and quite often, people will just have mediocre experiences on mobile devices instead. Their desktop experience will be incredible, will be fully featured, and their mobile versions will just be watered down versions of their desktop experiences. And that's kind of shitty. It's no longer sufficient to do that, especially when so many people are now using your smartphones. You're intentionally harming your business and your conversions, etc. It is not a good idea. You need to start paying attention to responsive web design even more today. Also, Google changed the way they rank websites a little while ago as well. Their SEO metrics and algorithms changed. What they did now is that if your website is responsive, it has a higher chance of showing up for mobile users. So if your website's not responsive, it will immediately appear lower than it could have just based on that. So if you want to check and see whether or not your website is responsive up to Google standards, you can quickly look for their mobile testing website. I threw in FITC's website just to check it out. You're good, FITC. You're good. Which is awesome, and it's super, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to have that test pass. So I highly recommend you do that and immediately improve your SEO for mobile devices if you haven't already made your stuff responsive. Google's also working on something called AMP. AMP stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages. What that essentially means is that it's a subset of HTML, so it's not all of the features that exist with HTML or with CSS. Like you can't use iframes, and you can't use a couple of additional things. You can't load too much JavaScript in. And it's built for performance and built for mobile devices. So for example, next time you're Googling things, or in the future when you're Googling things, pay attention and see if you see something that looks like this. You might notice that little AMP icon with that little lightning bolt. That means that that website has been optimized for Google AMP. And the awesome thing is that this is mobile only. They are now focusing on building websites that are just for mobile experiences. That's it. They don't really care about the desktop counterparts. They want to make sure your websites are light, fast, and snappy. And a cool thing that happens if your website is fully ampable is you get a little lightning emoji in your HTML tag. How dope is that? You don't put that in, it just shows up by itself. It's pretty cool. So at Shopify, for our blog, this is something that we're currently actively doing. We want to head towards the direction where our all of our blog posts are AMP friendly and will show up like that in Google searches. So Facebook's instant articles might be something that you've seen but may not have noticed. If we look at that particular icon there, they have a little lightning bolt kind of thing too. This is Facebook's own equivalent of AMP called instant articles. And when you click it, they immediately take you to an article. It's a slightly different experience. They are incredibly, incredibly fast. This is the direction where people are heading in. Mobile could not be more important than it is today. It is absolutely incredible. So, looking ahead, what am I excited about? More AMP and instant articles. I think this is going to be super big. I think you should start exploring it. This hasn't taken up, and it still takes quite a while to get approved by Google and Facebook to have them amped or become instant articles. This will become more and more, this will become increasingly easier to do. There's also the CSS grid layout. This isn't Bootstrap. This isn't like creating grids. This is an actual new CSS spec being released by the working group. So flexbox controlled single directional flow. So it was, you had your main axis. It was like left to right or right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. Whereas now we're going to have two-dimensional content flow. We'll be able to create really complex grids and do all sorts of really insane shuffling of content using the CSS grid spec. If you're interested in learning more about the CSS grid spec, I highly recommend checking out Rachel Andrews' stuff. She's probably one of the only people talking extensively about this. It's very, very early. The browser support is completely garbage. It looks like shit. But it's okay. On Chrome and on Firefox, you can turn on experimental flags and actually start using it today and like play around with it at the very least. If you want to see examples, if you go to gridbyexample.com, this website's built by Rachel Andrews. She has a ton of examples and a ton of use cases where grid is going to become extremely, extremely helpful. Web components. Web components are little modular elements. All of their CSS is scoped to those items themselves. For example, the HTML video element that has a little play icon, that has a little draggable slider, that has the pause icon, that is a web component. And slowly over time, web components are going to be a spec that you can create yourself. You can create your own web components for websites that will allow you to have scoped CSS that can respond and be responsive by itself. If you want to check out how this might work, you can look at a Google project called Polymer. Polymer essentially is like a JavaScript polyfill or a temporary band-aid to achieve similar results. It's very, very cool. It's very unique. If you've looked at React at all, this kind of has a similar vibe to it, but it's a little bit more scoped off, which is cool. There's also something called element queries, which is kind of in a CSS spec. It's like still tons and tons of discussion being held around it. And there is a JavaScript polyfill for this right now. What it essentially is you're writing CSS. Instead of saying @media to write CSS that responds to your viewport size, it responds to the size of the element itself. So if you drop your element into a skinny sidebar, you can have it behave one particular way. If you take that same element and drop it into a really big main section, it'll lay out in a completely different way. So it's that same element without having to resize the screen. It changes its layout and its properties and its visual aesthetic based on the size of the element itself, based on the real estate that it has. VR is crazy. If you haven't tried VR, find some way to try VR. It will blow your mind. Experiences are becoming 360s. Stuff's going to be all around us. We're going to have VR Sublime Text, and our minds are going to explode. I'm kidding. I hope no one makes VR Sublime Text. That would be insane. But eventually, we're going to be doing some crazy-ass Minority Report stuff, and our brains are going to explode. So, my hope is that responsive web design becomes so common, so obvious, that it's no longer a second thought. It is just a given on every single project, and responsive web design becomes just web design. That responsive is included in absolutely everything. An awesome article that I read, and I forgot to source, I apologize, said that the responsive web design is essentially to respond to all known web browser devices. Any web browser device, we have to be able to respond to those and optimize them to the best and greatest ability possible for all of our visitors, That includes accessibility issues, that includes performance issues, that includes outdated devices. If this is the direction that we want to head in, web browsers are working towards this. We all have to do our part. Designers should educate themselves and learn what the limitations are of the web, what's coming in the future, and together we can do one hell of a job and make Emma proud. Thank you.